The horse came in from the north on a Thursday morning in the late summer of 1878, and the people of Caldwell, Kansas who happened to be on the street when it arrived would remember for the rest of their lives the specific quality of that arrival, the way the rider came through the town's northern edge at a walk rather than a gallop, which was wrong, because men who arrived at a walk were men who belonged somewhere and knew it, and this man did not belong here and the entire town could see that. Before he had covered 50 yards of their main street, and yet there was nothing tentative in the walk, nothing that suggested arrival as supplication, as request, as the posture of a man presenting himself to whatever judgment a place might have prepared for him, and the Caldwell town marshal, a man named George Hooker who had held the position for 4 years and had developed in that time a workable intuition for the taxonomy of arriving strangers, stood on the porch of his office and watched and understood, before the rider had covered half the distance between the town's edge and where Hooker was standing, that this particular stranger fell into a category he had encountered exactly twice before in his career, a category for which he did not have a clean name but which he recognized the way you recognize a weather system that has a particular relationship with the landscape it moves through, which is to say before it arrives and with a certainty that has nothing theoretical about it. The rider was Wyatt Earp, though George Hooker did not know this yet, and the specific knowledge of who was arriving would not significantly change what Hooker had already understood about the situation, which was that whatever had produced this man and whatever had happened to him recently and whatever had reduced his ammunition to the specific quantity it had been reduced to. And Hooker did not know this quantity yet either, would not learn it until later that day when the full account came out, but he would have believed it when he heard it because it fit the profile of the arrival with the precision of an explanation that was also a story, which is the best kind of explanation. All of that had converged into the specific figure now coming down his main street on a horse that was also tired in the patient way of animals that have been asked to do something difficult and have done it without understanding why, and the combination of the tired horse and the unhurried walk and the quality of the man's stillness in the saddle produced an overall impression that Hooker would later describe to his wife, struggling for language, as the impression of a man who had used everything he had and was still here, which was not the same as a man who had won. Wyatt Earp had left Dodge City 3 weeks earlier under circumstances that the official record would later describe with the diplomatic compression that official records bring to events that resisted clean categorization, and the circumstances were these. A cattle drive from Texas had arrived with a crew that included, toward its tail end, 4 men who had been employed for the drive but whose primary professional identity lay elsewhere and whose presence on the drive had been, for the trail boss, a matter of practical convenience and mild ongoing anxiety, and these 4 men had decided, in the way that men of their specific professional background sometimes decided things, that the most efficient conclusion to their time in Dodge City involved a set of actions that Wyatt Earp, in his official capacity, was required to prevent, and the prevention had gone in the direction that preventions involving 4 men and 1 lawman generally went when the 4 men in question were competent and the 1 lawman in question was Wyatt Earp, which was in Wyatt's favor but not without cost. The cost in this instance being measured not in the usual currencies of injury and legal consequence but in the more specific currency of ammunition expended, and when the accounting was complete, the 4 men in various conditions ranging from unconscious to arrested to a third condition that required different paperwork. Wyatt had conducted the inventory that men in his position conducted after situations of this kind and found that his cylinder contained 2 rounds, which was 2 more than he needed at that precise moment and an insufficient number for the situation that was developing simultaneously on the western edge of Dodge City, where the remainder of the Texas crew, numbering 7, had heard about the direction events had taken with their 4 colleagues and were in the process of developing a response that Wyatt correctly assessed as requiring more resources than 2 bullets and a reputation. He had made the decision with the characteristic economy that defined every decision he made in situations of this kind, which meant that the decision had been made before it was consciously experienced as a decision, before the specific reasoning had been assembled into anything that could be articulated, because the assessment and the conclusion and the action had all happened in the same compressed moment that bypassed the slower processes of deliberation and produced instead the immediate clarity that long practice generates in men who have done exactly this enough times to have moved the relevant calculations out of the conscious mind and into something that operated faster and with less overhead. And what the decision produced was not a plan to address the 7 men on the western edge of Dodge City, not a request for backup that the available backup would have been insufficient to provide in the available time, not a strategic withdrawal and regrouping, but simply a direction, north, and a pace, unhurried, and a destination that had been determined not by any prior intention but by the specific geography of what was available in that direction and at that pace, which eventually, after 3 weeks of the kind of travel that leaves both horse and rider with the specific gravity of things that have been moving for a long time and have not stopped moving until right now, produced Caldwell, Kansas, and George Hooker's porch, and the quiet walk down the main street of a town that had not asked for Wyatt Earp and had not known it needed him and would spend the subsequent months discovering, with the mix of gratitude and discomfort that characterized every town's relationship with the specific kind of help Wyatt Earp provided, exactly what his arrival had meant. George Hooker came down off his porch and walked out to meet the rider, which was not something he did with every arriving stranger but which the particular quality of this arrival had produced as an appropriate response, the way certain situations produce their appropriate responses before you have consciously decided to respond. And Wyatt Earp stopped his horse and looked down at Hooker, and the 2 men regarded each other in the specific way that men in adjacent lines of work regard each other when they are trying to establish, without the inefficiency of asking directly, whether what they are dealing with is a colleague or a problem, and the assessment on both sides reached its conclusion in approximately the same amount of time, which was not long, and the conclusion on both sides was the same, which was colleague, though the specific texture of the collegiality was different for each of them. Hooker's assessment being that here was a man who knew what he was doing and whose presence in Caldwell was going to have consequences he could not yet fully specify, and Wyatt's assessment being that here was a man who was looking at him without the particular quality of look that preceded the kind of conversation he did not currently have the ammunition for. He stepped down from the horse. He told Hooker his name. Hooker told him later that he had heard the name before, which was true, because the name had been moving through the cattle towns of Kansas for 2 years in the way that names move through communities organized around a particular kind of ongoing problem, accumulating as they move the specific authority that comes from being attached to outcomes. And the outcomes attached to Wyatt Earp's name were of the variety that cattle town marshals paid attention to when they heard them, not because they necessarily believed every particular of the accounts, which grew in the telling the way all such accounts grew, but because even the deflated and skeptical version of the account still described a man who had a specific relationship with the situations that produced them, a relationship that was not luck and not simply skill in the technical sense but something that combined elements of both and added a third element that most people who tried to describe it arrived at by way of negation. Which was to say they described what it was not recklessness. It was not fearlessness in the sense of an absence of the relevant neurological response, it was not the simple dominance of physical capacity over opposition, and having described what it was not they tended to stop, because what it was did not yield to direct description and the attempt to force it into language produced accounts that were accurate in their details and insufficient in their totality. The town of Caldwell in 1878 had a problem that was not unusual for its type and time and geography, which was to say it had the problem that all cattle towns at the terminus of a major trail had, which was the problem produced by the intersection of large amounts of money, large numbers of men who had been doing difficult physical work in isolated conditions for months, a service economy organized specifically to separate those men from that money as efficiently as possible, and a legal infrastructure that was, relative to the scale and intensity of the situation it was supposed to govern, a suggestion rather than a constraint, and into this intersection Caldwell added a specific local variant that distinguished its version of the standard problem from the standard problem itself, which was a cattle broker named Ellis Drummond who had, over the previous 18 months, acquired a degree of economic leverage over a significant portion of the town's commercial activity that had translated, through mechanisms that were individually ordinary and collectively extraordinary, into a degree of political leverage over the town's legal apparatus that had made the town marshal's position, in practice if not in title, something considerably less than what the title implied, and George Hooker, who was a competent and honest man placed in a position that had been structurally compromised before he arrived in it, had been doing for 4 years what competent and honest men in structurally compromised positions do, which was to work within the constraints of what was possible and maintain, at significant personal cost, the minimum threshold of functional order that prevented the situation from collapsing entirely into something that would require a different and more drastic response. Wyatt Earp listened to the shape of this situation over the course of the afternoon, assembled from what Hooker told him directly and what Hooker communicated through the specific omissions and deflections that a man in Hooker's position deployed when discussing the architecture of his own constraints with a stranger whose trustworthiness had not yet been fully established. And by the end of the afternoon Wyatt had a picture of Caldwell that was accurate in its structural dimensions if not yet in all its specific details, and the picture he had was of a place that had arrived at the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single acute crisis but from the accumulated weight of a chronic condition, the exhaustion of a town that had been managing a problem for long enough that the management had become indistinguishable from the problem itself. To articulate this need and no reliable mechanism for acting on it, something to change. What Wyatt had was 2 bullets and a name that had arrived in Caldwell before he did. What Ellis Drummond had was a cattle brokerage that controlled the movement of money through the town, 3 men who functioned as a private enforcement apparatus for his commercial interests, a working arrangement with the county government that provided legal cover for activities that would not have survived direct scrutiny of the environment rather than a contingent achievement that required ongoing effort to maintain, which was the specific configuration of overconfidence that Wyatt Earp had encountered in enough variations to recognize on contact and to understand, with the particular understanding that comes from having processed many such encounters, that this configuration had a systematic vulnerability that was not visible from the inside of the configuration but that was legible, to someone who knew what to look for, from the outside. The vulnerability was this. Ellis Drummond's enterprise depended, at its operational core, on the assumption that the mathematics of his position were settled, that the calculation of who had leverage over whom had been run and the answer was stable and not subject to revision, and that the people in his environment were operating on the basis of this settled calculation and would continue to do so because revising it would cost more than accepting it, and this assumption was correct as long as the people in his environment were the people who had always been in his environment, meaning people for whom the settled calculation was a fact of life that predated their own engagement with it, something they had arrived into rather than something they had evaluated and accepted, and the introduction into this environment of a person for whom no such settled calculation existed, who was encountering the arithmetic of Caldwell fresh and without the accumulated weight of having lived inside it, produced a specific instability in the system that Ellis Drummond's model did not account for and was not structured to handle. Wyatt spent 4 days in Caldwell before the first direct engagement with Drummond's apparatus, 4 days during which he did what he always did when he arrived somewhere new and needed to understand it, which was to be present, specifically and consistently present, in the places where the town's actual functioning was most visible, the saloon that served as the informal clearinghouse for commercial information, the livestock pens where the practical economics of the cattle trade were conducted at the level of individual transactions, the margins of conversations that were not addressed to him but that he listened to with the flat attentiveness that he brought to everything that might be useful, and in these 4 days he assembled, through the accumulation of small observations that were individually insufficient and collectively comprehensive, An understanding of how Caldwell actually worked that was more accurate and more operationally useful than anything a formal investigation would have produced in the same time, because formal investigation asked questions and the questions changed the answers, and what Wyatt was doing produced answers to questions nobody knew had been asked. The first direct engagement came on the fourth evening, in the form of a man named Cole Reardon, who was the most senior of Ellis Drummond's 3 enforcement assets and who had been watching Wyatt's movements through the town with the professional attention of a man whose job it was to assess new arrivals and determine their implications for the existing order, and who had arrived at the conclusion that Wyatt Earp's specific pattern of movement and attention constituted a form of reconnaissance that, if allowed to continue to its logical conclusion, would produce a level of understanding that was not in Ellis Drummond's interests for any stranger to have, and who had therefore been authorized to have the conversation that was designed to communicate to Wyatt, with whatever degree of emphasis the situation required, that Caldwell had an existing arrangement and that existing arrangements had costs associated with disrupting them that typically exceeded whatever a stranger had to gain from the disruption. Cole Reardon was a capable man who had conducted many versions of this conversation successfully, which is to say that the men he had conducted it with had received the communication and adjusted their behavior accordingly, and his success rate in these conversations was high enough that he had developed, around the conducting of them, a set of habits and assumptions that were appropriate to the population of men he had previously conducted them with and that were not appropriate to Wyatt Earp. The most significant of which was the assumption that the conversation would follow a predictable structure in which Cole Reardon communicated the costs and the other party processed the communication and the conversation concluded with an understanding, and this assumption was not appropriate to Wyatt Earp because Wyatt Earp did not process communications of this type in the way that the assumption required, did not receive the information about costs and update his behavioral calculus on the basis of it, not because he was incapable of updating behavioral calculi, he was in fact exceptionally good at it, but because the specific input being provided was not information he didn't have, it was a restatement of information he had already incorporated into his assessment of the situation and had weighed against other considerations and found, in the context of those other considerations, insufficient to change anything. Cole Reardon communicated the costs. Wyatt listened to them with the patient, flat attention he brought to everything. He told Reardon that he understood. Reardon waited for what he understood to produce, and what it produced was not the adjustment he was waiting for but a question, which was whether Reardon was available tomorrow morning, because there was something Wyatt wanted to show him. And the question was delivered in a tone so entirely devoid of either aggression or submission that Reardon spent several seconds trying to locate it within his existing framework for how these conversations went and finding no available location, which was itself a communication, and the communication was received in the part of Cole Reardon that was older than his professional training and that had survived because it was good at exactly this kind of reception. And what it received was that the framework was wrong and that the man in front of him was not a version of any man he had spoken to in this capacity before, and that the appropriate response to this information was something he would need time to determine, and so he told Wyatt he would think about it and left, which was not the conclusion the conversation was supposed to reach but was the only conclusion available to him. Ellis Drummond heard about the conversation from Reardon that night and spent the following morning in a state of cognitive friction that was unfamiliar to him, because the cognitive friction was produced by information that his existing model of his situation could not process cleanly, which was that a stranger had arrived in Caldwell who had received Cole Reardon's standard communication and responded to it in a way that did not fit any of the available response categories, and the unavailability of a clean category for the response was itself more unsettling than any specific threatening response would have been, because a threatening response would have activated the standard countermeasures and the standard countermeasures worked, and a non-categorizable response activated nothing, left the standard countermeasures running in neutral, and produced instead a quality of uncertainty that was, for a man whose entire enterprise was built on the settled calculation of known Quantities, deeply uncomfortable. George Hooker came to see Wyatt the morning after the Reardon conversation and told him that he needed to understand what he was dealing with, meaning Drummond's depth of entrenchment and the specific ways in which Drummond's arrangement with the county government provided legal insulation for activities that would otherwise have been addressable through official channels. And Wyatt listened to this with the same flat attention he brought to everything, and when Hooker had finished, Wyatt told him that he understood, which was the same thing he had told Reardon, and which in both cases was true and in both cases meant something different than the person hearing it tended to assume it meant, because understanding a situation and being constrained by it were, for Wyatt Earp, different relationships to the same information. The confrontation with Ellis Drummond came 12 days after Wyatt's arrival in Caldwell, and it came in the form that confrontations with men in Drummond's position tended to come when the preliminary negotiations had failed to produce the accommodation the position required, which was a direct, physical, public assertion of the terms that the preliminary negotiations had been unable to establish through conversation, an assertion conducted through three men whose professional function was to make the assertion legible and whose presence was intended to communicate that the terms were not a request but a statement of how things were, and the three men were Cole Reardon and the two others who made up the remainder of Drummond's enforcement apparatus. And they came to the saloon where Wyatt was sitting in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and the saloon went quiet when they came in, with the specific quality of quiet that saloons in cattle towns developed when men came in with that purpose and that manner, a quality of quiet that contained within it a long history of situations that had gone badly. And Wyatt was sitting at a corner table with a glass of water, and he did not stand up when they came in, and he did not reach for the weapon at his hip, and he did not, for several seconds, do anything at all except look at them with the flat, patient, measuring look that had preceded every difficult thing he had ever done in a room. The mathematics of the situation were these: 3 men against 1, the 3 men being competent professionals who had conducted many such assertions and whose competence was real and had been tested, and the one being Wyatt Earp, who had 2 bullets, which was a number that was not 3 and that anyone in the room who was doing the arithmetic correctly would have assessed as insufficient, and the arithmetic was correct as far as it went. And the problem was that it did not go far enough, because it counted bullets and men and stopped there, without accounting for the specific way in which Wyatt Earp's relationship to these numbers was different from the relationship that the arithmetic assumed, which was the relationship of a man calculating whether he had enough resources to prevail in a conventional engagement, and Wyatt was not calculating this, because his assessment of the situation had proceeded past the question of the conventional engagement to the question of what preceded the conventional engagement, which was the calculation that the 3 men across the room were running right now about whether to proceed to the conventional engagement, and this calculation was the one that mattered, and it was the one Wyatt was working on. He stood up. He walked toward them. Not fast, not slow, with the same unhurried pace that he had used when he rode into town, the pace of a man who has somewhere to be and is going there and has not yet found a reason to adjust his pace in either direction. And the 3 men watched him come and did the thing that men watch him come and do, which was to run the calculation that his approach required them to run. The calculation about what kind of man walked toward 3 men who had come with this purpose at this pace with this expression, and the calculation was complicated by everything they had heard about him in the preceding 12 days and complicated further by the specific quality of his approach, which was not the approach of a man who had assessed the mathematics and found them in his favor, but the approach of a man who had assessed the mathematics and decided they were not the relevant mathematics, and the irrelevance of the mathematics to the man coming toward them was itself information, and the information was received in the part of Cole Reardon that had received the information from the previous conversation and filed it under something is wrong with my framework, and what the new information added to that file was, the framework is wrong in a way I cannot fix in the time available. The 2 men flanking Reardon reached the same conclusion at approximately the same moment. All 3 took a step back. Wyatt stopped in front of Cole Reardon and looked at him for a moment, the same look he had given him in the previous conversation, and then he told him something, in the low, even voice that people who overheard his conversations in situations like this one invariably described as too quiet to make out clearly. Something that Cole Reardon heard and that turned the specific sequence of small muscular events that constitute a man's decision to do something into the specific sequence of small muscular events that constitute a man's decision not to, and the three men left the saloon, and the saloon remained quiet for a while after they left, and then it became slowly, unevenly, incrementally less quiet, the noise of ordinary life returning in stages the way light returns after something has blocked it and then moved on. Ellis Drummond was arrested 48 hours later on charges assembled by George Hooker from evidence that had existed for 2 years and that had not been assembled before because the assembling of it had required the specific confidence that comes from believing the assembly would produce a result rather than simply a target. And that confidence had become available when Wyatt Earp had walked toward 3 armed men with 2 bullets and the 3 armed men had left the saloon, because the leaving of the saloon was information, not just about the 3 men but about the mathematics they had been maintaining on Drummond's behalf, and when the mathematics left the saloon the thing they had been maintaining left with them, and what remained was the evidence, and the evidence was sufficient, and Drummond went to the county seat. And Caldwell began the slow process of recalibrating to a version of itself that did not require his arrangement. Wyatt stayed in Caldwell for 3 more weeks after the arrest, not because the situation required him but because departure at the moment of resolution had a specific quality that he had learned, through accumulated experience, to avoid, the quality of a presence that arrived for the crisis and left with the crisis, which was a presence that served the crisis but not the place. And Wyatt's relationship to the places he worked was more complicated than that, complicated in the specific way that it is complicated to care about something you are not staying in, and so he stayed for 3 weeks and did the ordinary work of the position that Hooker now held without the structural compromises that had made it something less than what it was supposed to be, the daily unremarkable work of a town that had decided to function as a town. And on the morning he left he had 11 bullets in his cylinder and 2 in reserve and a direction that was not yet a destination, and the horse was less tired than it had been when they arrived, and George Hooker stood on the porch of his office and watched him go with the expression of a man who has been given something valuable and knows it and knows also that the giving was not personal, that the value was real but the source of it was moving on, that the settling of accounts this particular presence had made possible was complete and the presence was therefore no longer required, which was the nature of the thing, which was always the nature of the thing, which was the specific condition of being Wyatt Earp in the places that needed him and could not keep him, and the hoofbeats moved north out of town and became quieter and eventually became part of the ambient sound of the Kansas prairie, which was wind and grass and the enormous indifferent distance in every direction, and George Hooker went back inside, and Caldwell kept going, and Wyatt Earp rode toward whatever the next town was going to require of him, carrying with him the specific weight of every previous town and every previous requirement and every person he had left behind in a condition that was better than the one he had found them in, which was not nothing, which was everything he had, which would always have to be enough. The 2 bullets became, in the telling, a kind of shorthand for something that resisted fuller description, the way good shorthand always compresses something real rather than replacing it with something invented, and the people who told the story in subsequent years were telling it because it captured, in the specific image of a man riding into a town that needed him with only 2 bullets and what he was, exactly the ratio that Wyatt Earp's life had always maintained between the conventional resources of his situation and the unconventional resources he brought to it, which was to say that the conventional resources were always somewhat less than the situation required by any straightforward accounting, and the unconventional resources were the thing that closed the gap, the thing that the accounting did not have a column for, the thing that made 2 bullets the right number for a man who understood that bullets were one variable in a calculation that contained variables the bullets were not able to address and that he was, because of everything he had built himself into over the years that had produced him, able to address by other means, and the town of Caldwell had understood this, in the end, and Ellis Drummond had understood it, and Cole Reardon had understood it before either of them. Standing in a saloon watching Wyatt Earp walk toward him with the specific walk of a man who had already finished the calculation and found the result sufficient, and what all of them had understood, in their different ways and at their different moments of understanding, was the same thing, which was that the 2 bullets were not the point, had never been the point, and that the man carrying them had known this when he rode into town and had ridden in any way, at a walk, unhurried, with somewhere to be. There is a particular kind of authority that announces itself through scarcity rather than abundance, that derives its force not from the accumulation of overwhelming resources but from the demonstrated sufficiency of insufficient ones, and this kind of authority is rarer than the other kind and considerably more durable, because the other kind depends on the continued availability of the resources that produce it and is therefore vulnerable to any change in that availability, whereas the authority that comes from doing what needs to be done with what you have does not depend on anything remaining constant except the man himself, and the man himself is either that thing or he is not, and no change in circumstances can create it in a man who lacks it or remove it from a man who has it, which is why the story of 2 bullets traveled the way it traveled and meant what it meant to the people it reached, because what it was really a story about was not bullets at all but about the specific kind of man for whom the number of bullets is a secondary consideration in the calculation that determines whether he rides in, and the primary consideration is whether the town needs him, and if the town needs him he rides in, with what he has, which is always enough, not because the arithmetic guarantees it but because of what he is underneath the arithmetic, in the place where the arithmetic does not reach. George Hooker told the story for the rest of his life, not compulsively, not as the central exhibit of his own experience, but occasionally, in the right context, when the specific shape of it fit something that was being discussed or needed to be understood, and what he told it to demonstrate was always the same thing, which was not the outcome, though the outcome was the point in a practical sense, but the specific quality of the arrival, the walk, the pace, the unhurried certainty of a man who had used everything he had and still had enough. And this was the part that stuck with the people who heard it, because it was the part that translated beyond the specific circumstances of Caldwell in 1878 into something that the people hearing it could hold against their own experiences and find useful, which is the test that separates the stories that last from the ones that don't. The ones that are about something real enough to remain relevant after the specific circumstances that produced them have been long resolved. And the story of Wyatt Earp riding into Caldwell with 2 bullets lasted because what it was about was not bullets and not Caldwell and not 1878 but the question of what a man does when what he has is less than what the situation requires, and the answer that Wyatt Earp had given by riding in at a walk, unhurried, with somewhere to be, was the answer that the people who heard the story carried with them into their own situations, their own insufficient arithmetics, their own moments of needing to decide whether to ride in or turn around, and the answer was, you ride in, and you carry what you have, and what you are is the variable that the arithmetic does not know how to count, and if you are the right thing, which you will not know until you are already riding, it will be enough, and it will always have been enough, and the town will remember that you came. He rode north out of Caldwell the way he had ridden in, at a walk, with the same quality of directed unhurried motion that communicated destination without advertising it, and the Kansas prairie opened up around him in every direction with the vast indifference of terrain that has been here longer than anything riding through it and will be hereafter, and the sky was the particular blue of late summer in that part of the country, hard and clear and without the softness that would come in another 2 months, and the horse moved steadily beneath him and the grass moved in the wind, and somewhere behind him Caldwell was going about the business of being a town that had recently remembered how to function, and ahead of him there was distance, and somewhere inside the distance there was whatever came next, and Wyatt Earp rode toward it with 11 bullets and 2 in reserve and everything else he had ever been and done and survived and carried, all of it present in the specific quality of the ride, in the pace, in the stillness of his hands on the reins, in the way the morning light came across the prairie and found him moving through it, a single figure in an enormous landscape, going somewhere, knowing why, carrying exactly what was needed and nothing more and nothing less, which was always the way, which was the only way, which was the way it would be for every town that waited ahead of him in the distance, visible or not, named or not, needing him or not yet. Knowing that it did.